And talking about SBF and FTX situation, they as well advocated for crypto regulations in front of the Congress a lot of times. And as well, particularly, they supported the Senate Agriculture Committee's Digital Commodities Consumer Protection Act, introduced by Chair Debbie Stabenow and Ranking Member John Boozman. And it would empower the Commodity Futures Trading Commission through increased funding and oversight. But at the same time, people oversaw it as de facto ban of DeFi, which SBF and as well Coinbase supported, but other people from the Web3 world severely opposed it. And as well, there was another interview between with SBF and Eric Voorhees, and there was as well the same example as you made with email and SMT protocol, that you shouldn't regulate the protocol itself, you should regulate just the apps, the entities. So what is your opinion on that act? Is it good or bad? And if it's not perfect, what amendments should be made to it to make a beneficial regulation?
Yeah, so I think we agree with the discussion that has happened publicly in the Senate Agriculture Committee and most recently in testimony given by CFTC Chairman Benham that a rethink of the bill is appropriate and necessary in light of the involvement of FTX and some of the issues that were raised around how it treated DeFi. We think DeFi, if addressed, needs to be addressed positively. Certainly a bill that passes through a committee or let alone one that passes through Congress cannot and should not ban DeFi in any shape or form and cannot be applied, to DeFi protocols. And so to the extent that the bill in a prior form may have done that, we think more thought is needed. And we're working hard to, educate policymakers on what that could look like. Again, using our regulate not apps approach to how some aspects of DeFi that pose legacy risks, could be addressed in a very productive way that can add integrity to the DeFi ecosystem while not, disadvantaging from a competitive perspective any centralized firms. And so I think one of the issues broadly in creating, policy and legislation is, the definitions of an entity or an activity and how broad those are, what they scope in, and whether or not the rules or requirements that it provides, can be complied with, or if not, the result is a de facto ban of that technology or that activity. And so I think a lot of attention is going to have to be paid to in Congress as legislation is being developed around how to define various entities and activities so that the regulations that fall under each of those definitions are appropriately calibrated to those entities and to the risks that they pose.
Yeah, DeFi regulations are quite tough, and as well we saw some requirements from CeFi entities on KYC procedures to their clients, which, for example, in DeFi it's not required at all. As well as there are some talks that people who use DeFi may avoid taxation and so on. So what should be approach to the regulation of DeFi, and how should DeFi be regulated to keep financial privacy of the users?
So I kind of think about this first at a very, very high level. And the analogy I like to use is kind of an ecosystem that exists in nature, right? And if you have an ecosystem that has come out of balance, there's usually something that comes in on the opposite side of that spectrum that creates conflict and that reestablishes balance, right? And I think that there has been a balance that has been tried that policymakers have tried to achieve by combating illicit finance and combating terrorism financing and the support and transfer of wealth to oppressive regimes or those that are either declared enemies of other jurisdictions or that are bad actors on the world stage. Balancing that with the privacy of individuals to freely transact. And at least in the United States, we are a nation of individual freedom and liberty. Privacy is a key part of that. And so getting that balance right, I think, is critical. And I think there's an argument to be made that the application and execution of certain rules has maybe swung the pendulum pretty far in the direction away from privacy. And so it's not surprising to me that through this technology, something else has come in to try to reestablish, that balance. But I think that that's the important point. I think the important point is balance. It's about allowing users to transact privately while trying to ensure, to the best that we can, that funds aren't being, diverted to terrorist activities or illicit activities or to, antagonistic state regimes. And I think the technology actually can play a big role in this, especially through things like zero knowledge proofs. Some of my colleagues, including Michelle Korver and Joseph Burleson and Dan Bonet, have thought a lot about how technology can play that productive role, and that zero knowledge proofs can give the ability for protocols to actually do some level of verification without exposing users, information and creating honeypots of private data. And on that point, I mean, I think one of the risks of the existing system that we have is that the government does collect a lot of information. How it uses that information is something that I'm not incredibly familiar with, although some of my colleagues are. But it's irrefutable to say that it does create, a pretty big and deep database of information that needs to be protected. And I was part of, a hack of a government agency that, was storing a lot of people's sensitive information. And so, there does need to be a balance between allowing users to, have privacy and protect their data, while allowing the government to serve, the objectives of laws that are on the books. And you can't argue that those laws don't exist, because they are there, and government agencies have to execute against them until they change. So to the extent that we can protect users' information, not create honeypots of information, while also trying to address concerns around illicit finance by using the benefits of this technology, I think that could be a win-win.
Yeah, that's true. And as well, in terms of DeFi, some DeFi protocols are forced to keep US users away. For example, one each blocks US trades as they're not licensed in the US. And they plan to launch their separate entity for the US, as well some other platforms have. But this restriction as well can be easily avoided by the use of VPN. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, so I think, broadly speaking, there is activity that invokes registration obligations in the United States. For instance, in the derivatives world, it is illegal, through CFTC regulations, for a U.S. person to offer or enter into derivatives transactions not on a regulated exchange. And so, to the extent that some of that activity is being allowed, right, especially through centralized apps, right, it's not surprising to me that some of those firms and businesses have taken the view that they need to block people from certain jurisdictions from accessing them, because they wouldn't comply, with the rules of that jurisdiction. I think there are a couple other pieces of that. Another is that I don't see it as a viable alternative for U.S. Congress or policymakers to ban its own citizens from using VPNs. But to the extent that they want to hold businesses accountable for allowing VPN access, I think that that's a debate that policymakers can have, and it's more appropriate at that level. But we certainly, as a firm, are not going to condone individuals using VPNs to bypass laws.
And as well, there was another case with UkiDAO, which offered as well to users, including US, leverage trading with derivatives too. And then a16z joined UkiDAO defense case against CFTC and argues that commodities regulator must serve in the lawsuit against individual members, not the DAO as a whole. So what's the progress with that case, and what should be the right approach to regulate DAOs?
So I think there were a number of things about the Oki DAO complaint that the agency filed that are problematic and that set concerning precedents. One of them is the standard it used for holding any individual DAO member accountable for any and all future protocol activities simply by the virtue of that member having voted on anything at any time. That's a very broad view of liability, and it's one with which I'm not sure I agree. And it's not one that I think is well scoped to the agency's jurisdiction. And so that aspect of that case is concerning. I think there's the other issue, which is around the service of process, like you said, and we did file, a16z crypto did file, or a16z as a whole actually did file an amicus brief around service of process, arguing that in order to serve what the CFTC deemed as an unincorporated association, they had to, by virtue of serving one member or claiming that they couldn't serve anybody as a part of that group, that they did have to claim that there was a lawful purpose associated with that entity, right? And so our view is that lawful purpose is developing and administering and managing software. I think that there are a number of other issues in that case that deserve to be, fully aired and debated and argued and adjudicated. And the unfortunate place we find ourselves now is that none of the members from Oki DAO appeared in court, and the CFTC has moved to file a default judgment asserting the facts in the case as given. And it would be, unfortunate if a lot of those, those very significant policy and legal issues set a precedent just by virtue of a default judgment, as opposed to really being fully debated in court. But I do also want to say that these weren't necessarily good actors. I mean, they did create something with the intention, with recorded chats or messages to try to escape regulation and use something as a shield. That is certainly not what we would ever, encourage anyone to do or to argue for. But there do need to be appropriate lines drawn, and we think that there are some, legacy models of liability that can be applied to DAOs, through an unincorporated association structure, that gives something legal representation, that give a DAO the ability, to pay service providers, enter into contracts, actually pay taxes, create positive benefits, allow it to appear in court, but that do shield individual members from individual liability, like many existing corporate structures do. Mm-hmm. So I think that's going to be an ongoing discussion that we have at the state level in the United States, to see the appetite for embracing something that we think can provide a lot of positive benefits to state and federal tax revenue, as well as to legal representation. But that's still going to be a work in progress.
So in your opinion, all DAO should be registered entities, right?
I think it depends on what the activity it is that they're doing. I mean, if they're narrowly managing a protocol, if they're more centralized as opposed to decentralized, if they're feeing off of otherwise regulated activity, if they're distributing fees as profits to their members, I think you start to invoke a lot of kind of the legacy financial risks and touch points that have existed for a long time. And it's hard to argue that things like that should escape regulation when centralized trading venues would be highly regulated, again assuming something passes Congress to do so. So I think it's going to depend on how the DAO is structured and what it does, how broadly or narrowly it's the activity is focused, the ability it has to make substantial, meaningful material changes to the primary purpose of the protocol. So a lot of it's going to be facts and circumstances driven.
And you as well mentioned in your article on Web3 regulation two types of Web3 businesses, for-profit and non-profit ones, public goods businesses. So what should be the difference between regulation of those two types of Web3 businesses?
Well, again, I think if you're operating a business for profit and it's engaged in otherwise regulated activity, I think that regulators and policymakers will take a stronger view as to their authority over that activity. And I think that starts to, harken back to legacy aiding and abetting principles in law. That if you are, profiting from, an illicit activity, if you're marketing illicit activity, facilitating illicit activity, and directly engaged in that illicit activity, illicit meaning that it's being done in an unregulated basis when comparable activity is regulated, right? It's going to be hard to argue that you're not somehow involved with that. So I think, the idea of having an app that is for profit, again, on a spectrum, moves something more squarely in, the regulatory jurisdiction, has more touch points with traditional policy concerns, whereas something that is more non-for-profit and isn't profiting off of illicit activity, isn't necessarily facilitating or marketing illicit conduct. I think that starts to, on that spectrum, get more into more of the freedom of speech area of law, and deserves more protections, against overreaching regulations, because there is a balance there that's going to have to be walked, and those lines are going to be hard to draw. But those are some ways that we start to think about, where policymakers may be concerned, and that was kind of an opening attempt to start drawing some of those lines.
Yeah, that's true. And can you tell us as well, what are you currently focusing on as head of policy at a16z?
So I think it's, broadly speaking, it's ensuring that the next version of the internet, that Web3 has a productive policy and regulatory framework to thrive while protecting its consumers, and its participants from risk. So that regulation needs to be appropriately calibrated. It needs to recognize the benefits, and it needs to be upgraded to fit the existing technology and allow for that innovation to actually occur. We're focused on bipartisan solutions. We think the most durable, workable regimes over time are ones where numerous policymakers and members of Congress from different political ideologies have worked together to form a consensus, and where stakeholders' views have been heard and likely incorporated. We need to get this right. Web3 is not going away, right? Protocols are going to continue to exist, right? Individuals are still going to be able to access them. The question is whether or not that can happen, well in regulation that provides, both protection and market integrity and allows for innovation, or whether or not it's driven to offshore jurisdictions that don't, and that pose more risks to those consumers.
Yeah, hopefully the right regulations will be rolled out so that our Web3 industry will be able to thrive. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and expertise with us and educating us on the right approaches to the regulation.
Thanks, Anna. It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.